Jeffrey Epstein was somebody that was networking with all factions of power that he could get into in order to be useful to this power network. And so he took it upon himself to try and infiltrate parts of the Bitcoin community. Put together a 10-year plan. Don't do what they want you to do. They want you on your device, on social media, building your social credit score, putting your assets in custody, borrowing against it, going deeper into debt, worrying about what the algorithm is trying to galvanize you in, hating everybody, religious tension, racial tension, all of the different tensions. They're trying to radicalize you into a corner based upon your algorithm. And they want you to own nothing and be happy. So just do the opposite of what they are pushing you to do right now. Think about yourself, sovereign, your family, your community. That's what matters. They're trying to distract you from all of that.
Hi there and welcome back to Reinvent Money. My name is Paul Buitink. This is a weekly podcast about money and power. And today on the show for the first time is Bitcoin OG and macro geopolitical analyst Simon Dixon. With Simon, I'm going to talk about the state of Bitcoin, Epstein's interest in Bitcoin, gold and silver, and power dynamics in general. Who is really pulling the strings in our world? Hi, Simon. How are you?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think you're gonna say when we first met in 2015.
Yeah, we realized we met 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, at a conference in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I organized that, and you were one of the speakers, together with Max Keiser and Andreas Antonopoulos. Totally different time. It was an amazing conference. We met there, and now we're here more than 10 years later. Incredible.
Yeah, I reckon that was when the block war debate was going from a backdoor room to becoming a public debate until it was resolved in 2017. Yeah. So that was right in the middle of that phase, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And you've been advising and educating people about Bitcoin since 2011, I believe.
Yeah, what's that, 15 years now? Yeah, unbelievable.
And you're still not fed up with it.
I'm still here. I don't know why I'm still here, but I'm still here.
Yeah. No, I remember 2011 that I also went to a conference where it was like a bankers conference, and Amir Taki was one of the speakers there. And so that was the first time that I heard someone talk about Bitcoin in public, and especially because it was like a bankers event. He was totally not appreciated there. It was just like, what is this guy talking about? But that was one of the triggers for me to really start exploring it and to understand it in more detail.
Yeah, no, Amir organized the first Bitcoin I think it was called the European Bitcoin Conference at the time. There was one in New York and then one in Prague. And he invited me to speak at that event. And that was when the price of Bitcoin crashed from $30 to $3 at that time.
Yeah. Wow. Ages ago. So tell me, what's going on with Bitcoin? Because if I look at the price chart, it looks horrible, of course, with Bitcoin losing almost half of its market cap since its peak last year. And we're basically back at the levels that we last saw before Trump got elected again. And then there's also this association with Epstein. I know you have an opinion on that too, but I noticed that a lot of precious metals investors, they make fun of that. So what's the current mood within the Bitcoin space? Tell me.
Yeah, so I guess throughout that whole history of Bitcoin in the 15 years that I've been involved with it, we create a lot of enemies. It seems to have upset a lot of people. Like initially, it was us versus the banks, and then the banks kind of had various attack vectors, like through creating alternative blockchains and various other things. But obviously, before I was a Bitcoiner, I was a monetary reformer, and we used to talk about gold and how to return to a gold standard, and how to rein in the fiat currency money printing and the fact that money is created as debt and the implications of that. So, the gold community were a little bit hostile towards Bitcoin, depending on whether they bought it or not. There were people that maintained the ideology of both. They, I think, play in a similar market, solve different problems. But we've always had the gold enemies. And then I alluded to it earlier. We had various attack vectors that led to community splits. And the community has been fractured and fractured and fractured. But at the same time, as the price of Bitcoin went up, we grew a lot more adoption until we were $1 trillion plus asset. And Wall Street realized, okay, the traditional attack vectors aren't there, so we need to embrace it and try and centralize as much of it as we can. And then we had, the real introduction of government level state plays. And then we had Wall Street deciding that this is an asset class that they can make a bunch of money off. And so, throughout that whole time, they started constructing the mechanisms to do to Bitcoin what they did to gold, which is that they firstly tried to centralize a bunch of it. The central banking system and wars centralized as much gold as possible in the hands of central banks and wealthy financial institutions. And then they would take the gold reserves and they would create paper receipts and fiat currency. And they would create fractional reserve banking. And then they would use gold as collateral and they would lever up the system as far as it would go. And in order to lever it up, they'd try and get people to borrow against their gold, or they'd create derivative contracts using the gold as collateral. And so you ended up with, massive amounts of derivatives that had a tiny amount of people that actually needed to legitimately hedge against pricing risk in gold, but the vast majority used for financial speculation. And then eventually, you build this derivative complex. You use leverage in order to turn everyone into degenerate gamblers. And then your job is to try and custody the gold as much as possible. And so you end up in a game where you use fiat currency and leverage in order to play a game of Monopoly where the banker ends up with all the assets. And so that's kind of the history of gold. Eventually, people realize that the only way to get gold at scale is to store it with someone else or to use an IOU. And so, a bunch of people end up with a gold IOU or gold in custody with somebody else with a receipt and a promise that they can collect on it. And then eventually those paper receipts turn into lots of fraud and games to oppress the price. And then eventually everyone wants the actual gold, which is what we're experiencing right now with central banks are saying, I want the gold. The pleb saying, I want some of the gold. And everyone else is just trying to get price exposure to it. But the gold doesn't actually exist because there's all these paper contracts. So I would categorize Bitcoin as that stage where we've now built the Bitcoin derivative complex. We've had multiple attempts through Bitcoin treasury companies in order to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. We've used debt capital markets and equity capital markets to create Bitcoin ETFs. And now Wall Street are at the stage where they're trying to custody as much Bitcoin, get you to leverage as much of your Bitcoin through the derivatives complex, and also borrow against your Bitcoin so that they can use the hedge funds to create volatility, steal your Bitcoin, centralize as much of it as possible. And there's a core community that are then going to be holding it in self-custody. And that effectively, in the end, becomes a rush to get Bitcoin in self-custody. And then there's not enough Bitcoin, and we're going through the same cycle, really.
Yeah. And so at first banks tried to fight it and now they are trying to co-opt it with the end goal then for Bitcoin to exist as a reserve asset, or do they still prefer to get away with it completely?
Yeah, I mean, look, Bitcoin, governments around the world have been completely corporate captured. So governments have just become a mechanism for private financial institutions to make as much money as possible. we don't have stock markets anymore. We have money printing. We have the consolidation of everyone's pension, ETFs, insurance premiums to pump markets. And we have media capture in order to control narratives. And so those are markets at the moment. So the private sector wants to get as much Bitcoin as possible. And so they want to custody it. They want to use it as an asset on banks' balance sheet. They want to put it in the stock market. They want to offer debt products and further products and get as much of it as possible. And so the best way to do that is to manipulate the short-term price. Bitcoin's a fixed supply asset. So it's probably long-term one of the hardest ones to manipulate. But short-term, the hedge funds will just will create volatility. I remember when the Trump administration and BlackRock launched the Bitcoin ETFs, I was constantly debating with people to tell them not to borrow against their Bitcoin, that not to buy a Bitcoin treasury company, that Bitcoin in an exchange or an ETF or in custody is not Bitcoin. And so I continued that ethos, but kind of Bitcoin went, you didn't really need to tell people about Bitcoin anymore because now the entire world knows Bitcoin. They've got very bad misperceptions about it, so that requires a bit of education. But it's more about giving people the better habits, because we're not in the, it's not the when we were 50 people in a room trying to tell the world about Bitcoin. We're now, everyone has heard of Bitcoin. They just have a perception of it. But I remember debating, and people were like, well, the adults are in the room now. Wall Street is here, and the banks and regulations and state actors and treasuries and all sorts of strategic reserves and various other things. And Bitcoin's going to lose its volatility. And I said, no, we've just let in the amateur manipulators to the money printing manipulators that can use their hedge fund complex in order to create just as much volatility and just as much swings. So like everyone was thinking that it's going to be like a steady, mature asset with high liquidity. And I said, no, I've watched my $30 Bitcoin crash to $3. I've watched my $20,000 Bitcoin crash to $3,000. I've watched my $70,000 Bitcoin crash to $15,000. And we now just watched our $125,000 Bitcoin go to about $65,000. And I was telling everyone to expect that, be prepared for that. Why? Because they're in the game of leverage and they want to margin call you, or they want to take your Bitcoin and they want to custody as much of it as possible. And they will use short-term price manipulation in order to do that. And they have a lot more tools than the previous small little hedge funds and exchanges and industry we had before.
So do you expect the price to crash further then in order for these financial players to scoop up more Bitcoin to get it out of the hands of ordinary investors?
Yeah, volatility is the name of the game for hedge funds. They'll play every trick under the sun as they make as many services and create as many margin calls. And look, I've made one rule. Like in Bitcoin, we've been in a bull market for 17 years or whatever it is now. And as long as you've got a 5-year time frame and a 10-year plan, I expect that to continue. And so, as long as you own more Bitcoin this month than last month, then that served myself well, and the hundreds of thousands of people around that are in a life-changing position right now, because they stopped trying to guess when the price is doing. And they just put together a plan in order to boycott the system, escape the system, learn self-custody, own more Bitcoin this month, and start pricing things in gold rather than dollars, and Bitcoin rather than dollars, so that they can avoid the optical illusion. So I expect more volatility. Maybe it needs to go down further. Maybe this is the bottom. But the advice, I think, has always been the same. Own more hard assets this month. And Bitcoin solves a self-custody problem that nothing else can solve, in terms of self-custody at scale that's auditable, that you can send anywhere and escape any tyrannical government, no matter what situation you find yourself in.
Yeah, a lot of Asians I seem to think that Bitcoin has become a sort of a Western tool, like and not so much something they would be interested in. They prefer gold and silver. Do you see that split too? That Bitcoin is mostly used by people in the West and not so much by people in Asia, for example?
Well, that's a really interesting thing because most of the early volume came from China. There was a lot of volume from South Korea, Japan. I think they're still there. Like what we're going through now is a shift to multipolarity, and so when China made the Bitcoin mining ban and took the hash power from 60% to 20% in China, and then America realized that it could use Bitcoin in order to make the grid more efficient and utilize wasted electricity, and that there was a mining industry that was built around Texas. We ended up creating a China issue to an American issue. And America definitely has very high adoption rates and very large parts of the ecosystem. But it was better when a lot of the applications were predominantly being built in America, but the mining was really a Chinese thing. But now we've got way more geographical diversification with countries that hate each other in terms of mining. But in terms of mining pools, we've got like 3 major ones in China, 1 major one in America. We got 40% of the hash power as an estimate in America. That's spread across multiple public companies. But I think we have an American centralization problem, but I think it corrects itself because we're currently going through a shift to a multipolar world. Wall Street, which is the largest, most liquid capital markets in the world, they've been centralizing as much Bitcoin as they can. And I think we still enter into that battle that in a multipolar world, what are you going to do? The world is selling US treasuries right now. There is de-dollarization happening at a scale we haven't seen before. Everyone's looking for fixed supply assets. But it's actually very difficult to get gold right now. It's actually very difficult to participate in these commodity rush right now. And so at some point, this becomes a self-custody story when you realize that Bitcoin's the only thing you can self-custody at scale. In the meantime, I think a lot of people are going to realize that a multipolar world will drive a lot more innovation in Bitcoin on a global stage. And remember, it was a massive psyop what they're doing in America. They weren't building an environment for Bitcoin. None of the companies ended up coming to Bitcoin. They're still in Dubai or British Virgin Islands, in Cayman and El Salvador, the tax neutral jurisdictions, because tax neutrality was one of the most important parts of it. But what are they building? Well, they're building a crypto surveillance state, stable coin, 1984 Orwellian nightmare, social credit score, AI integrated way of rolling over the US government debt and creating tokenized real world assets where they can custody the real asset, give you a token, and you will own nothing and be happy. So the World Economic Forum is building crypto capital in America as a police and surveillance state, and regionalizing stable coins while the rest of the world looks at gold and the rest of the world can escape using Bitcoin as self-custody. It's a global play. I think Bitcoin has always corrected itself based upon the reality of this ginormous geopolitical and macro play that it now sits in the center of.
Yeah, and what about central banks? Then they are accumulating gold at a record pace. If you look at the surveys done by, for example, the World Gold Council, it seems like they're going to buy up even more gold. Yet their inclination to buy Bitcoin has been going down. When you expect central banks, especially of BRICS nations, to start accumulating Bitcoin as well, or maybe they're already doing that without saying it, of course. That's how I would do it, at least. First accumulate for low prices and then announce it, and then see your value go up. But what's your take on central banks and their approach towards Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin as a reserve asset of a central bank is virtually non-existent. They still choose gold, and they're interested in central bank digital currencies. Bitcoin is a mechanism for escaping that Orwellian nightmare and boycotting that system. And so, the longer central banks decide not to accumulate Bitcoin, the better. At some point, they probably will add it as a reserve asset. What I'm seeing is more countries that are using sovereign wealth funds at the governmental level that are accumulating a Bitcoin position. That then adds layers of governance, so they end up using ETFs or treasury companies or some kind of governance structure in the middle that a sovereign wealth fund is more comfortable with. We've got some state level in America at a very small scale using ETFs. And then we've got countries that sit outside the dollar dominant system that are using Bitcoin mining. And I think Bitcoin mining is more of a mechanism for a sanctioned country, for example, creating an internal Bitcoin circular economy to try and help the internal economy. And Bitcoin mining has proven very, very useful for that. And then we've got smaller countries that have been using, like Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, that have been using repurposed, hydroelectric energy to mine Bitcoin. In Africa, we've been seeing people use it, in order to repurpose and do innovation around solar grids and stuff like that. So what I'm seeing is more of an energy play in terms of Bitcoin mining. Sovereign wealth funds accumulating Bitcoin positions via proxies, but central banks are not in the game, and so I think that's interesting as well in itself, because a country can remain sovereign from its central bank. Most people think of them as the same thing, but remember, most central banks came from the Bank for International Settlements and a Bank of England system that was set up to colonize. And so most people's central banks are tools for essentially playing in a colonized world. We're now entering into multipolarity, and so central banks may just become, rather than tools for Western colonies like the American Empire and the British Empire, leftover power, actually becoming more sovereign. And so I'm expecting it become a strategic sovereign wealth asset, which is always what Bitcoin has done. It's sovereign individual, a company that wants to be sovereign, and a country that wants to remain sovereign from external central banking forces.
Yeah. And what about Epstein's love for Bitcoin? I find it interesting to see and to read how, I mean, there's just so much going on, of course, with the Epstein files, but to see that he was very much interested in understanding the financial system. He was very early with Bitcoin. In 2011, he already found out about it. He also knew the risks of fractional reserve banking. So he was very well versed, I guess, in the topic of monetary reform and alternatives. And he did do some investments in Bitcoin companies in the early days, like Blockstream and Coinbase, and did a donation to MIT. So how do you look at this whole Bitcoin Epstein association?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, if you don't understand Bitcoin, you're going to be very confused. Bitcoin is a decentralized network that has pockets of attack vectors that can try to be centralized, but no one can centralize the whole piece. And so I talked about it. You've got nodes. We've got 25,000 nodes, which is people that back up the historical record of all transactions and all blocks. You've got miners that are able to add new blocks, and they receive a reward for creating this largest distributed supercomputer running a node is trivial, so anyone is able to do that in terms of cost. Then you have these mining pools, which normalizes the revenue across the miners. Then you have all of the different companies, and they interact with users. And then you have developers. Jeffrey Epstein was involved in, I believe, supporting various divide and conquer strategies to try and infiltrate different parts of the ecosystem. And from the Epstein files that we have seen so far, because what is Jeffrey Epstein? He's a compromise agent. So his job is to, and there's many Jeffrey Epsteins. He's just one. There's thousands of them. But he was an asset that power was purging. And so we're now getting all of these releases around what he tried to do. And we get clues around what he tried to do. A compromise agent means that if you want introductions and you want to rise to power, then you have to be compromised so that you are all glued together in order to maintain shadow power that's larger than government. And so Jeffrey Epstein was somebody that was networking with all factions of power that he could get into in order to be useful to this power network. And so he took it upon himself to try and infiltrate parts of the Bitcoin community. So firstly, we know that he didn't create Bitcoin. The evidence suggests that it was around 2011 that he tried to figure out who are the people in Bitcoin that I need to get to know. And so he originally messaged Amir Taki that we talked about, because he was the main character in Bitcoin at the time, and Gavin Andresen. Gavin Andresen decided not to meet him. Amir Taki went to find out whether he could fund, and then found out who he was, and he said that they didn't take any funding for their project. That's what we know about the earliest parts. But then we know from emails that in 2014, Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were emailing each other, and they were debating. They were saying the community doesn't know whether they're a median of exchange, a store of value, or a unit of account. They're all very confused. And Peter Thiel confirmed, is this part of the operation? In order to paraphrase me right now, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was around a destabilization type of campaign. So Jeffrey Epstein was involved in trying to, I believe, split the community. And so what do we know? What else do we know? Well, we know that Jeffrey Epstein and Brock Pierce were connected. Brock Pierce was when at one of the Bitcoin conferences, maybe around the time that we spoke at your conference. He tried to persuade me that Satoshi Nakamoto is Dr. Craig Wright, and he was insisting. Gavin Andresen was the one that said Satoshi Nakamoto is Craig Wright, and I cryptographically have the proof. And so Brock Pierce was the one that brokered Coinbase investment via Jeffrey Epstein, and also brokered an investment into Blockstream. And so what do we know about all of this? Well, Brock Pierce created Tether. That was a digital dollar that is now being created as a surveillance state tool within the crypto capital within America. So it was like a gateway drug of taking this technology into a surveillance technology that is centralized, can be seized, can be frozen, just like Tether did in Venezuela recently. What else do we know? We know that Blockstream took a bunch of the developers and they essentially created, a narrative around the importance of keeping blocks smaller and innovating layer 2 technology. We also know that Dr. Craig Wright, Gavin Andresen, combined with people like Roger Ver and various others, took the other side of the narrative around large blocks. And so we had this civil war at the time that fractured the community around the narrative of, is this a unit of account? Is this a store of value? Or is this a median of exchange? And so it looked like there were multiple attempts. And we know that and there's evidence that somebody called Andy Back, that also there was logs saying Adam Back and the founders of Blockstream went to Epstein's Island. So I think we can say that there were attempts to infiltrate the via Blockstream. There were attempts to infiltrate via Bitcoin Cash. There were attempts to infiltrate via Tether, but the system resisted all of these attack vectors because it's fundamentally nobody controls all the parts of the ecosystem. Now, Coinbase, if you remember, joined, the big block kind of theory. And so all of these different players, I think there was an attempt, which they didn't succeed, in order to create a divide and conquer, fracture the community up into smaller parts and get what they originally wanted to do, which is launch a central bank digital currency and a surveillance state. And we know from Jeffrey Epstein, he tried to, for example, create Sharia compliant cryptos and pitch it to Saudi Arabia. He also tried to create stable coins and pitch it to Russia. He was networking up. I'm not saying he got these meetings. This is somebody that was trying to climb the network, be useful to power, and create these blackmail and infiltrations. And clearly, Bitcoin was important enough in order to do that. And then Peter Thiel did it with all the Silicon Valley side. There's a whole lot more there,
right?
Yeah.
But do you think that Blockstream is compromised based on what you just said, and possibly them going to the island and him investing in Blockstream, or you don't think that's the case?
I think Blockstream is an actor that, unless they came out and explained that they had an investment via, I think it was Digital Garage. There was a meeting with Jeffrey Epstein, and then we've heard nothing about meetings on the island. I think that should be explained. And until people have a comfortable answer, I wouldn't personally be comfortable using any services that Blockstream produced. And so that's how this network works. It's an open source boardroom. No one's more important than the entire ecosystem. And I think I personally haven't seen the answers that I'd like to see to be comfortable trusting anything that comes from anyone that's connected to Blockstream without reasonable explanations. Is it compromised? I think there were attempts to compromise. Was it compromised or not? We don't know. But I don't think anyone should take what they did and connect it to Bitcoin. I think, me personally, if I had been, infiltrated, I would either be too scared to say anything, so I'd be ignoring it, or I'd distance myself and say I'm not good for the community anymore. So step aside, put in a new board in Blockstream, and everyone decide whether they want to use their services or not. But the most important thing is that it's not important enough to the ecosystem, and we always need to resist these attack vectors rather than ignore them.
Yeah. And to talk a bit more about the Epstein files, this is just, it's a huge amount of documents, but we haven't seen the whole of it yet. So millions of documents more, I think, will be published. Of the existing documents, a lot is still censored and redacted. So we're probably going to see a lot more information coming from the existing documents as well going forward. Where is this going to end? Because I noticed that they already had so little confidence in their politicians across the globe, whether you talk about the US or Europe or Britain. But with these documents released, people even have less confidence in the people that are supposedly run the world in a proper way. So what's going to happen next when it comes to these Epstein files, and what's going to be the impact on our mindset of the people and all of that?
Yeah, excuse me. So it depends on who you believe controls the Epstein files. Personally, I believe that government is completely subordinate to corporate power, and the main lobbies that control governments are financial, technical, and military. And so I took the proof of work concept and kind of developed this proof of weapons concept to help people understand how power works. Historically, the military industrial complex has utilized what we call the deep state or the intelligence network, CIA, Mossad, MI6, in order to utilize war to gain access to resources. And then you have a financial industrial complex, which, because all of these companies need access to capital, the original form of leverage before you go to some of the degeneracy of Epstein is financial leverage. Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the ability to create the fiat currencies. The closer you are to the money printer and the closest is the bank, the more leverage and power you have. I personally believe that the financial industrial complex, the donor class, are the ones that are not being mentioned. And so they're purging some assets. And which assets are they purging? Well, Jeffrey Epstein, who some speculate on whether he's alive. I personally believe he's not that important to keep alive. He's just one of many. So I think he was a disposable asset that became a liability. But they've just purged Lex Wexner. Now, Lex Wexner was the estate management, Victoria's Secrets, and various other things. And some of these big money laundering transactions for tax evasion and various other things. Now, he's so old that, that's the one they decided to purge.
He's expendable.
What else haven't they purged? Bank of New York Mellon. By the way, the Mellon banking dynasty, the second largest contributor to the Trump administration. The largest one was Elon Musk, part of the technical industrial complex. The second largest was the Mellon banking dynasty, which is the financial industrial complex. The third largest was Mariam Edelstein. That's more Mossad, deep state, military industrial complex type of operations. Those are the three largest funders. And we've seen we're transitioning to a surveillance state. We are weakening the dollar. Massive changes are happening in the world and geopolitics. So I believe that the Epstein files, while probably hosted by the Department of Justice, they're being curated by the financial industrial complex. And so what do I believe the FIC want right now? Well, from my understanding of geopolitics, the FIC are partnering with sovereign wealth funds, and China is the largest sovereign wealth fund. They're managing the strategic weakening of the dollar. They're increasing interest rates at the Bank of Japan to break the Japan carry trade. NATO is escalating with Europe in order to suck up all the euro dollars in order to weaken the dollar. Once you weaken the dollar, you break the pegs to the dollar, and then that breaks the petrodollar. Now, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds are fully funded by China purchasing oil. America is an energy exporter. So the petrodollar is breaking, which breaks the currency pegs. And so effectively, the world reserve currency is being strategically managed and weakened by the financial industrial complex. And so by releasing these Jeffrey Epstein files, I think it's another purging of various assets that are no longer useful to power and strategically weakening everything that propped up the dollar. Because remember, while Trump has a narrative, we're taking on the deep state is what created the world reserve currency. So if you take out the deep state in America by purging various assets, hide real power, this isn't going to lead to the people that run these operations getting arrested. It's just going to be some token people that are purged and thrown under the bus. But you absolutely destroy the reputation of everything that propped up the dollar and justified global covert wars that propped up the dollar. So to me, this is a strategic shift to making sure everybody is on track with managing this global transition to a multipolar world. And that's why it's being released now.
Right. Well, that's mind blowing. A few follow-up questions then. So firstly, Musk is part of the technical complex, so he of course, he's not as powerful as people portray him to be, but he is part of that elite. Yet he also, of course, appears in the files in a very negative way. Is that just a warning to Elon that he should keep on playing ball because they have probably more dirt on him, and this is just an example?
Yeah, remember, most people that we quote unquote call like these billionaires and richest people in the world, it's based upon their net worth, their wealth, and their wealth is mainly paper assets. You know, Elon, in the case, a big chunk of his wealth is his stocks, and those stocks are levered up, and so he bought X by borrowing against his stock. So his net worth is a function of financialization, securitization, which means that you are subordinate to the financial industrial complex. And so if you want your share price to be maintained in an environment of money printing and market manipulation and index funds, then you are subordinate to financial power. They can destroy his share price, they can destroy his net worth, and he's levered up as well so that they can, if you get to buy X, you have to turn it into a tool for social credit scores and backdoor data plays. He also got Doge. Now we got Palantir. Now we got David Sachs, all of the original PayPal mafia. They're doing stable coins, artificial intelligence for war and military integration, and data, Doge, X, social credit scores. And now it's going into this digital ID era. What's he pushing? He's pushing, voter ID is important. Doing civil unrest campaigns in other countries like UK, border control. All of these are utilizing surveillance tools in order to usher in this technical industrial complex. So Elon is still subordinate to financial power because net worth is an illusion in this financial industrial complex. It's not gold. It's not Bitcoin in self-custody. He probably has a chunk of that. But if you put it down to the assets that he actually holds, it's probably not that wealthy compared to, other real sovereign wealth. And so all this to say, a lot of what you know today is an illusion. And if you are subordinate to financial power, if you have a public company, Michael Saylor, that relies upon selling equity and raising debt to buy Bitcoin, you've given a lovely tool for the financial industrial complex while pretending you're taking it on. And then if you get everyone levering against their Bitcoin, putting it in custody, as does Coinbase, you're just a tool for this greater power structure. And so Bitcoin in custody has effectively become a tool for power, and Bitcoin in self-custody has become a boycott and an exit of what we're finding out, that the system is propped up by weaponizing children, genocides, ethnic cleansing, and the trafficking of children, the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of weapons, and crimes against humanity. So you get to boycott that by owning your Bitcoin in self-custody or owning your gold in self-custody. The rest of it is custody for power to the very same financial industrial complex. And Elon works for that. And so part of that is you have to have leverage. And so Elon was ordering, in the emails, while claiming that Jeffrey Epstein wanted him to go to the island. The emails show that he was coming to the island. He was bringing his wife, that won't matter, about the orders that he was making, whatever those orders may be.
Yeah. And what about Trump and Steve Bannon? They were also very vocal about that these Epstein files needed to be released during the election campaign. But now these files are being released, and also this lengthy podcast that Bannon had with Epstein, and it makes them look really bad. So why would they be campaigning for something like that if it eventually backfires? Or were they promised by the financial elites, look, guys, you can go for it because we will keep these documents secret or whatever? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, a bit of background on Trump helps you understand it. So Biden was more of aligned with the military industrial complex, factions of power. Trump is way more aligned with the financial industrial complex. And so, what does the financial industrial complex want right now? They want to weaken the dollar, make America a regional power, and move to multipolarity. So, Trump works for that power structure. And so, he's an agent of chaos to make everyone work with China, go towards BRICS, be more multipolar, negotiate new deals, weaken the dollar, deconstruct what props up the dollar. United Nations, USAID, National Endowment of Democracy, deep state, wartime things. But then you look at where is Trump's real wealth? Well, Trump was effectively before Jeffrey Epstein. It was Charles Kushner was like the main one of the big blackmail operators, and Roy Cohn. Trump was mentored by Roy Cohn, and Charles Kushner had a blackmail operation that led to Jared Kushner, which was Charles Kushner's son, being married into the Trump family. Jared Kushner is doing a lot of these Middle Eastern deals right now, even though he doesn't actually work officially for the government. Now, if you go back to Roy Cohn, it was before that Meyer Lansky. So you had all this Jeffrey Epstein. There'll be more and more of them. Trump was deeply involved in all of that. Now, what the photos are, the old photos with Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, were because while he was rising to power in New York, which means you have to work with the mafia, and Jeffrey Epstein was, networking within those mafia networks, and and people, that's what's required in order to make it in New York, get access to Trump Towers and those types of deals. He also had, a Miss Pageant and a modeling agency, which one could argue is likely to have been a feeder into a Jeffrey Epstein file type of operation, which is what we're seeing, what Victoria's Secrets was and what Abercrombie and Finch was in terms of modeling and bringing these models into these networks. And so it's a grooming operation to power. And as you introduce more to the power, you get more deals, but you have to be compromised as you rise. And if you do enough for power, eventually you can play president. And once you play president, you work for your lobby. And your lobby, I believe Trump is connected to deal making, finance, real estate transactions. That's finance. And so he really works for technology and finance, where Biden was more military. And so that's why I think you can look at that, put that all together, and realize that Trump is turning America into a regional power, removing the dollar as world reserve currency, and painting it in a MAGA narrative while it builds crypto capital based upon civil unrest in order to manufacture digital IDs, stable coins, artificial intelligence, social credit scores, and turn America into, a surveillance and police state like they beta tested in UK.
And what about the dollar then? You say it's weakened. It's being weakened. Trump is an agent of chaos. They're basically advancing this new multipolar world order concept. So if we have the multipolar world order established, what's going to be the world reserve currency? Are we going to still use the dollar, or is that then maybe Bitcoin or gold? How do you see this constellation of currencies in this multipolar world?
Yeah, multipolar means multi-currency. So what we've seen in the Trump administration is a strategy of fiscal dominance. That means print as much money as possible and spend it into the stock market. So you favor bondholders, you roll over the debt, but you sacrifice the currency. And so what we've seen is that DXY is the measure of the dollar relative to Swiss francs, euros, Japanese yen, and a basket of major currencies. That went down 11% in 2025, and I expect to see that continuing. From its peak. We've also seen So we've also seen, obviously, when priced in gold and silver and commodities, we've seen, a massive devaluation of the dollar. But nothing, you can see everything is about printing money and spending it into stocks. And so that's an asset transfer that creates civil unrest, because already 92% of the entire stock market is held with the wealthiest 10%. And they're planning their exit in case it gets to civil unrest. They've already got their exit planned. That's what happened in UK. Basically, all the millionaires and billionaires left the UK, ended up in Dubai. And ironically, they were saying things like it's a Muslim invasion, so they all fled to a Muslim country, which is pretty funny, because there was no crime there, which shows how manufactured, these border policies are. It's multi-party. Don't take this as Trump derangement syndrome. Uh, Presidents don't matter. They all work for the same power. They just give you a new flavor to distract you. But anyway, you've got fiscal dominance. You've got DXY strategically weakening. And that means that as your currency gets weaker, you can start working on your national resources. So you've had national, Greenland, Panama, setting new borders in the Western Hemisphere. And then I think they're going to try and stablecoin dollarize Latin and Central America by destroying currencies like they always have been in Argentina, Venezuela, various other things. But they want it to be regional. And so just like when the British Empire, over a 10, 20-year period, the Great British Pound became the not so Great British Pound and regional, where it was only used in a few of its country and colonies. I think America is going to be doing the same thing. And I don't think we're making a coordinated, let's hand over from the British Empire to the American Empire. I don't think we're handing over to the American Empire to the Chinese Empire. China is very, very important, and I think will get bigger economically than America. It already is in purchasing power parity. But it will be multiple currencies. So every country is building their non-SWIFT rails right now. India's doing it. The Gulf countries are doing it. China's obviously done it.
Russia
doing it. So we're entering into a world of neutral assets, gold, Bitcoin. The central banks will use it as, I think gold will continue to be a central bank, which is why they're selling treasuries and buying gold right now. Now already gold has overtaken the treasuries as central bank foreign assets. And then I think Bitcoin's incredibly useful in a multipolar world. But I think we're going to have lots of currencies and no one dominating. So they're going to have to build the infrastructure for how do you price goods in a world where you're trying to hedge currency risks. And that will be the next big profit engine when the dollar, kind of loses its profit engine for real power.
Yeah.
I think.
So we have these regional blocks with also regional corporate interests, I would say. And back in the day, or at least up until recently, we would have global corporate interests. They would meet up at Davos, and they benefited from the rules-based order and being able to do business across the globe. But in this new setup, this multipolar setup, we will see a fractioned world with several currencies being used and with different trade blocks, perhaps. So for the global elite, it's not necessarily a better outcome. It's like a step back in a way, because markets are smaller, there's more friction.
Yeah, I mean, they have to adjust to the reality that they've asset stripped America. Remember, America's not a sovereign country, so it's fully corporate captured, and $65 trillion of its assets are foreign owned. And so America does not have the ability, the West in general, I mean, is not sovereign countries anymore. So they work for this transnational capital. And transnational capital is working across they co-opted all sovereign wealth funds. And then you have, different degrees of national, like China has a lot of capital controls and various other things. So it has more leverage in negotiating its position. But transnational capital is the one that's ushering in the multipolar world. And that's why we're getting most foreign stock markets are outperforming the S&P, and shitcoin fiat currencies are outperforming the dollar right now, because they are effectively dumping all the debt on the American people, suppressing the short-term interest rate so they can roll it over short-term, and then deregulating pensions so that they can dump all the subsidized low-interest debt on the American people. So they're rolling over the debt, doing fiscal dominance, artificially pushing down rates by regime changing the Federal Reserve, integrating fiscal and monetary policy, and dumping all the value into the stock market, which a massive chunk of it is foreign owned and controlled. So they're just asset stripping, which is why you're getting civil unrest in this K-shaped economy. That's the future for the entire West. Only those that have the assets benefit, and those that have the assets are investing capital outflows globally. And so this is the transition that we're witnessing right now. Stocks up, foreign stocks outperforming, dollar down, fixed price assets continue to play a more significant role and go up. And then lots of foreign fiat currencies that will be mismanaged and will be used. And there'll be lots of currency wars in order to reset power factions based upon compliance with transnational capital. So governments are subordinate. And how do they resist against transnational capital? By having sovereign wealth. So El Salvador's building its Bitcoin sovereign wealth. Kingdom of Bhutan's doing a similar thing. Singapore, Norway, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, China. Those are the powers, and they are coordinating in transnational global capital. And all the corporate interests, the people you see in Davos, they're just communicating. They're nodes in this network. They're not the ultimate power. Larry Fink, Elon Musk, Jamie Dimon, they work for this power. Their relative levels of compromise, because JP Morgan was Jeffrey Epstein's banker, but there's many more of those. But it's transnational capital that rules the world here, and they're acting in sync.
Wow. Very interesting story, Simon. A lot to chew on. Let's try to wrap up here and make it also very concrete and for our listeners and viewers. What can they do given this changing world order? And you've already alluded to how people should take care of their assets, do self-custody when it comes to Bitcoin, when it comes to precious metals. But any other things people can do in order to prepare for this change in power and this changing world order?
Yeah, the name of the game is sovereign. So you need to become a sovereign individual. If you've got a company, you need to make yourself as independent from Silicon Valley public markets, depending on your situation. And as a country, it's all about sovereign wealth. So that's the power. And so what do you do at the micro level? Well, you as an individual, you need to make a decision about, if you're deep in debt, what are you going to do with your debt? I can't make that decision for you. There was a time in my life when I was deep in debt, and I decided that at that conference in 2011, I was going to buy some Bitcoin at $3, and I didn't pay my debt, and I had to make that decision. Your debt is being devalued, and you have to decide what your play is there. Here's one thing: you have to own assets. Now, what assets you buy is going to make a big difference, obviously. If you're deeply connected to the US alone, then that's something you need to hedge in terms of if you're in stocks and bonds and traditional portfolios. If you want to be in the multipolar trade, then I personally believe you won't get the price of gold right or commodities right, but commodities are playing that role. If you want to be in the sovereign trade, then you need gold in self-custody or Bitcoin in self-custody. So that's the trade, right? Now, if you want to boycott the central banking system, then that's where Bitcoin and gold come in. So there's a side benefit if you want to boycott the evil that Epstein is one node in propping up. If you want to boycott the asset managers that are managing this, like BlackRock, then own it in self-custody rather than an ETF. If you want to boycott the banks, don't borrow against your Bitcoin. Don't mine fiat currency. Give them the asset so that they can margin call you, as many people did in this price correction that just happened. Then you got to think about, right, I may only be able to do that with $10, $100, $1,000. I don't know what's right for you, but it's percentages. It doesn't matter. You have to spend less than you earn and save the difference in assets. It's the only way to beat the game. And you need to buy. And if if it's just Bitcoin, if it's gold, whatever it is, you'll get better at this over time. Then you need to think about, if you want to boycott these global megacorps, then spend local. Start supporting your local farmers. Start supporting your local shops. Like, wherever you can, help your local community, because your local community is what's going to keep you safe at the end of the day. Some people will choose to leave country. You might be in a position to do that. Look at the world and say, in a multipolar world, where are the safest places to be? Where are the places that I want to live? Clearly, the West is going through a civil unrest campaign. That gets worse. It doesn't get better. They're not trying to fix this system. They're asset stripping the system. It ain't going to change. Your vote doesn't matter. Changing the politician doesn't matter. There's no law that's going to change anything. This is transnational capital. They are asset stripping the West. Yeah. They are investing and building other regions. You decide where you want to live. If you're not in a financial position to change country, then get out of cities and go more urban. Take a community with you and start looking at, how do you build community, rails in order to, source goods and start things like that. Put together a 10-year plan. Don't do what they want you to do. They want you on your device, on social media, building your social credit score, putting your assets in custody, borrowing against it, going deeper into debt, worrying about what the algorithm is trying to galvanize you in, hating everybody, religious tension, racial tension, all of the different tensions. They're trying to radicalize you into a corner based upon your algorithm. And they want you to own nothing and be happy. So just do the opposite of what they are pushing you to do right now. And that's the advice that I have for everyone. Put together, what do they want you to do? They want you gambling on Polymarket and mining meme coins and scamming people. Don't do that. They're turning you into degenerate gamblers. Like, become a 10-year plan investor, community member that's going to be useful to society, and think about yourself, sovereign, your family, your community. That's what matters. They're trying to distract you from all of that.
Well, that's very solid and practical advice, Simon. Thank you so much for your time. I will put your website in the show notes. It's simondixon.com. People should check out your site. Should also follow you on X, because you're very active, Twitter as well. Anything else you want to add, Simon?
Yeah, I'd just say one. Thanks for giving the website an X where I'm active. I'm very geeky in terms of every week. I don't listen to media, but I follow all financial. I read country balance sheets. I read company balance sheets. I follow financial transactions rather than listening. Everything that's happening financially is the opposite of what they're telling you on media and what the politicians are saying. And so every single week I go live on my YouTube channel, and I do This Week in Bitcoin and Tech, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics, just focused on analyzing based upon financial transactions to cut out all the noise of the politicians and media that are lying to you, gaslighting you right now, and taking you down a path where you're going to be less sovereign.
Great. Thanks so much, Simon. Take care, and I look forward to staying in touch. Next time shouldn't be in 10 years. Should be a bit sooner, I think.
Okay. We won't wait a decade. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Simon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.